Hey guys, a long time no see. So today I have another true crime case for you. And let me just start by saying that when it comes to serial killers, I think that today's case is the worst that you can get. You have a group of serial killers, cannibals, rapists, and necrophiles. And to top it all off, we are also getting some cult vibes with a very fitting name, the Reaper Crew or the Chicago Reapers. The crew had Robin Gist and his three mates, Edward Schweitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokoralais. They were suspected in the murders of 17 women in Illinois in 1981 and 1982 and an unrelated fatal shooting of a man in a random drive-by shooting. According to one of the detectives investigating the case, Robin made Manson look like a Boy Scout. In 1981, Robin Guest was a married father of three. And guys, before I move on, as you can tell, names here, again, I'm gonna be struggling with names. So I think that I'm just going to refer to this group by their first names. So you've got the two brothers, and I'll just say it either their first name when it comes to the brothers or one of the brothers. You get it, because it's just some of the names are just really hard to pronounce. So okay, so like I said, Robin, he was a married father of three in 1981, but he was also a devoted Satanist who at one point worked for none other than the one and only John Wayne Gacy. However, it seems that this was the only kind of relationship that they had, just a work-related one. It was during that time that Robin decided he wanted to have a following. He just wanted followers. And he started with 19-year-old Edward Schweitzer. Edward was living at the time with the Gecht family. The other two were brothers Thomas and Andrew Kokoralais, two teenagers who worked for Robin. And this was the start of Robin's cult. The three of them who joined Robin would later be described as simplistic or just having a borderline range of intellect dependent on authority, which worked quite nicely for Robin because he was the authority, right? He wanted followers, he wanted a cult. It seems that around the same year, around the month of May, the gang, they started lurking around in Robin's red van looking for some victims. And sadly, it wasn't long before they found one. 28-year-old single mother Linda Sutton was abducted on May 23, 1981, near Wrigley Field, Illinois. 10 days later, her body was found in a field in Villa Park, Illinois, with her left breast cut off, which suggested to authorities that this wasn't really your typical murder. On June 1, 1981, three detectives went to check on a call about a body discovered at the Moonlit Hotel in Villa Park, an outlying area of Chicago. This hotel was known for its shady characters. It was rumored to kind of be a place where you could meet someone for quick sex or for a drug fix, so that kind of hotel. A maid reported a terrible smell coming from somewhere near this hotel, which just got worse by the day. The Moonlit's manager walked out into a field filled with trash, with rubbish, behind the hotel to see what he could do to get rid of this really horrible smell. He expected to find some kind of a dead animal, but instead he found a young woman whose remains consisted mainly of bones and some flesh. The manager obviously immediately called the police. Three detectives arrived and they could see that this victim, she's been there for a while. She was so decomposed that they could see her skeletal structure, but the maggots were actually still there, which was quite an unusual combination of post-mortem characteristics. The victim was clearly murdered because she was bound with handcuffs before she was left there, probably before she died. She also had cloth in her mouth used as a gag and still wore a sweater and panties, but they had been pulled down to her thighs. In her socks, there were some dollar bills, so robbery couldn't really have been a motive for this. Police had to get the victim's identity, the manner, and the time of death. They delivered the body to the deputy coroner, Pete Sickman, to determine the cause and manner of death, as well as take fingerprints and teeth impressions to compare to records if they existed. A search for missing person reports turned up nothing, so detectives, they called the Chicago department, who told them that the practice of rolling money inside socks probably indicated that the victim was a hooker. The fingerprints and the dental records helped, and in less than 2 weeks they identified the victim as Linda Sutton. She was a prostitute with a few arrests. She was also the mother of 2 children, both of whom lived with Linda's mother. Despite the advanced state of decomposition of the body, the coroner actually determined that Linda was dead only for 3 days. The remains' advanced rate of decomposition was because of 2 large wounds to her chest, where her breasts had been removed, which allowed for an invasion of parasites which devoured the body in record time. Linda had been brutally assaulted and mutilated. 1 year goes by and there were no more attacks. So it might seem like this was just a one-off, right? Soon enough though, a 35-year-old cocktail waitress was abducted from her car on February 12, 1982. The gauge showed that the tank was empty, suggesting that she ran out of gas and maybe she tried to find help when she was abducted. Her purse was on the front seat and the keys were still in the ignition. A search turned up her naked body on an embankment near the road. She had been raped, tortured, and mutilated. The press was asked not to report that her breast was amputated so that the police could retain that detail for interrogations. A few days later, the body of a Hispanic woman wearing an engagement ring was discovered. She had also been raped and strangled. Her breasts were not removed, but they had been badly beaten. Her killer also masturbated over her body. A psychiatric assessment of this crime described the attacker as a local man who probably loved animals and had a family, but he also had a dark side, turning into a cruel psychopathic murderer at night. 2 other victims, 21-year-old Lorraine Borowski and 30-year-old Shui Mak, were abducted, their bodies only found a few months later. On May 15, 1982, Lorraine Borowski was taken just as she was about to open the realtor's office where she worked. She was repeatedly raped and then had a wire wrapped around her breast to sever it from her body. Finally, one of her attackers killed her with a hatchet. Her body was discovered 5 months later in a cemetery in Clarendon Hills, Illinois, in the same area where Linda's body was found. On May 29, Shui Mak was abducted from Hanover Park, a village northwest of Villa Park. Shui was abducted as she was returning home from her family's restaurant in Streamwood. She had been riding in her brother's car, but after they argued, he dropped her off to wait for a ride with other relatives whom he believed were following behind. They never saw her again. Her body was found 4 months later at the end of August, buried at a construction site, similarly mutilated like the other victims. 2 weeks after they abducted Shui, they picked up 19-year-old Angel York in their van, handcuffed her and slashed her breast before throwing her out of the van, still alive. For some kind of reason, they just let her go. So she reported this abduction to the police, but sadly her report didn't really help in catching the people who actually did this to her. She couldn't really say much about her attackers, and her description didn't produce any leads. Angel was, however, able to report that two men were using a red van to abduct women and hold them inside with handcuffs for rape and torture. They had even forced her to use a large knife to cut her own breast, which drove one man into a frenzy. He cut her more and he then masturbated into her wound before closing it with duct tape and then dumping her into the streets. That was in June 1982. The Reaper crew, they had a calling card, and yes, it was the breasts, actually the mutilation of the breasts. According to Thomas's later confession, Thomas, one of the brothers, the crew's victims were brought back to Robin's satanic chapel, which was in his home, where they abused, killed, and their amputated breasts were used in satanic rituals. With the release of Angel York, remember the victim that they let go? The crew, they laid low for about 2 months, probably because, they assumed that Angel, because they let her go alive, she would be able to identify them. So when that didn't happen, they just carried on with their twisted ways. What were they thinking? That they're not gonna get caught? They abducted 18-year-old Sandra Delaware, whose body was found on August 28, 1982, on the bank of the Chicago River. She had been stabbed, strangled, and her left breast was amputated. Her wrists were bound together behind her with a shoelace, and her left breast was removed. A bra was knotted around her throat. Her death was estimated at approximately 6 hours earlier. On September the 8th, 1982, another victim, 31-year-old Rose Beck Davis, a marketing executive, was found the same day that she was killed. She was found behind a stairway of a North Lakeshore apartment building in a wealthy Chicago neighborhood, having suffered almost identical injuries as Sandra Delaware. She was stabbed, raped, and strangled. A black sock was tied around her neck, her face was crushed, and blood pooled beneath her. She had been beaten with a hatchet. There were deep cuts on her breasts, and her abdomen was full of small punctures. During all of this, Robin had some issues with a drug dealer. On October the 6th, 1982, the crew shot 28-year-old Rafael Tirado and his friend, 18-year-old Alberto Rosario, at a phone booth in a random drive-by shooting. Edward Spritzer later claimed that he was driving the van when Robin spotted Rafael Tirado on the street, then told Edward to slow down. Robin then took 2 guns from the back of the car, told Edward to stop the car, and then opened fire on both Rafael and Alberto, hitting both of them. They were shot with a pistol and a rifle. Rafael Tirado later died of his injuries at a hospital. And Albert Rosario, he actually survived his injuries. Rafael Tirado was the crew's only male victim. 1 month later, 18-year-old Beverly Washington was abducted. She was found by a railroad track on December the 6th. Apart from other injuries, her left breast had been amputated and her right breast was severely slashed. And this would be the crew's last victim. But luckily, Beverly was still alive, and I don't really think that they planned that. She was taken to hospital and she was able to give a description of her attackers and the van that they used to abduct her. She said that the driver was a slender white man who looked to be around 25 years old, wearing a flannel shirt and square-toed boots. He had greasy brown hair and a mustache. He offered her more money than she asked for, and he seemed quite nervous. When he asked her to get into the back of the van with him, he had a gun. And then he ordered her to remove her clothing, and she listened. Then he placed handcuffs on her forced her to perform oral sex, and threatened her with violence if she didn't swallow the handful of pills that he gave her. As she passed out, she saw him holding a cord over her, and she was scared that she was going to die. The man then dumped her into the trash, one breast severed, but someone discovered her and called the police. Police officers who questioned her asked her about the van that this man was driving, and she said that it was red with tinted windows and a wooden divider inside. She said there were feathers and a roach clip hanging from the rearview mirror. Beverly's description led police to Robin's red van, which in turn led them to Robin. Within 3 weeks, the police pulled over a red van and questioned the driver. He had red hair and didn't resemble the victim's description, but the van fit the description perfectly. The driver told them that his name was Eddie Spritzer and the van belonged to his boss, Robin Guest. The officers directed Eddie to Robin's house and had him call Robin outside. When Robin came out, he fit the description down to his shirt and boots, but he acted quite casual and he was really willing to help, apparently. Later, the victim picked Robin out from a series of photos as the man who assaulted her. But when detectives went back to see him, Robin, he had a lawyer. Sadly though, this was just about everything that they had on him, the van. So because of insufficient evidence against him, they were initially forced to let him go. The crew were also suspects in the disappearance of Carol Pappas, the wife of Chicago Cubs pitcher Milt Pappas. She disappeared on September 11th, 1982. Her body was later recovered, but 5 years later, however, her death was ruled an accident. Police did suspect Robin's involvement with the Reaper crew, so they didn't give up just yet. After further investigation, police discovered that Robin had rented a room in a motel the previous year, along with 3 friends, each with adjoining rooms. So they went to speak with the hotel manager, who said that the crew were holding really loud parties and seemed to be involved in some kind of cult. The police managed to track down the other man, Edward Spritzer, and the brothers. Armed with search and arrest warrants, police arrested Robin, Edward, and Andrew on November the 5th, keeping them in jail on $1 million bond. When interrogated, Thomas, one of the brothers, he confessed, thinking that he's helping his brother. He said that he and the others had taken women back to Robin's place, what he called a satanic chapel. There they would rape and torture the women, amputating their breasts with a wire garrote. The crew would then, get ready for this, eat parts of the severed breasts as some sort of a sacrament, and Robin would masturbate into the breasts before putting them in a box. Thomas, one of the brothers, claimed that he once saw 15 breasts in a box. A search of Robin's apartment revealed the satanic chapel described by Tom, one of the brothers, and lawmen came away with a rifle matching the recent Torado shooting. Satanic literature was also retrieved from the apartment occupied by Andrew, one of the brothers. As the police interviewed more people, they learned that Edward Spritzer and the brothers were not alone in their fear of Robin or their belief in his powers. Others also claimed that he had a real ability to draw people to him and get them to do his bidding. One person warned detectives to never look into his eyes. No matter how sick or disgusting an act might be, he could inspire others to get involved. He got his start by molesting his sister, according to some accounts, and he was then sent to live with his grandparents. During his teenage years, and we are talking here about Robin, if I didn't make that clear. So during his teenage years, he developed his keen interest in Satanism and its secret rituals. The newspapers grabbed the whole story using headlines which linked the Reaper crew or the Chicago Rippers with the notorious Jack the Ripper. Robin, the only member of the crew to maintain his innocence, was never tried for any of the murders because of a lack of evidence. Robin, he tried to avoid the trial by offering an insanity excuse. He was evaluated for competency and he was found to be competent to stand trial, as well as being considered to be sane at the time of the offenses. He had a mistrial, so his second trial began on September 20th, 1983. The prosecutor had compelling evidence against him. In a search, the police, they found the chapel as well as a rifle used in a shooting. They also found a trophy box owned by Robin in which Andrew had described seeing as many as 15 pieces of female breast. From victim reports, the MO was detailed for the jury. Women had been kidnapped, held against their will, and tortured with implements such as needles and ice picks. They were also gang raped and then forced to endure having their breasts sliced off with a garroting wire so the men could use them for a satanic sacrifice. Often the victims died, but they had likely felt the horrendous pain of this mutilation before they finally passed away, apart from the two victims who survived. Robin took the stand to speak in his own defense. He admitted to attacking Beverly Washington, but in court he insisted that he killed no one and he was innocent of rape and aggravated battery. He said that during the time of the murders, he didn't even know the other defendants. But with all of the compelling eyewitness testimony as well as testimony from women who claimed that Robin asked them to cut off their nipples for him, the confessions of the others implicating Robin were not admissible against him. With no physical evidence linking him to the murder, he could not be prosecuted for any of the killings, and his accomplices were not willing to testify against him. In 1983, he was convicted of attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, deviant sexual assault, and rape for the non-fatal rape and assault of Beverly Washington. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Before sentencing, Judge Francis J. Mahone told him, quote, "Only a devil would do these things. An animal would not do these things. A monster would," end of quote. He pointed out that Robin had left Beverly Washington for dead and was lucky to not be on trial for murder. Robin, he is serving his sentence at Danville Correctional Center. His projected parole date is in 2042 on October the 10th, when he is 88 years old. So I guess that is safe to say that he's going to be spending his whole life in prison. Hopefully he is not lucky enough to live past 88 years. I know it might sound mean, but that's how I feel, and probably a lot of people feel the same way. In 1984, Edward Spritzer, in a bid for leniency, pleaded guilty to murder in the deaths of Shui Mak, Rose Davis, Sandra Delaware, and Rafael Tirado, as well as attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, deviant sexual assault, and rape. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His lawyer asked the jury to spare his life. In support, his relatives and associates testified that he was a docile young man with a history of being bullied. But a friend of his testified that he bragged about what he had done, referring to the women as broads and laughing over the fact that he mutilated and killed several of them. The prosecution insisted that he was every woman's nightmare and he was one of a pack of weasels. In 1986, he was convicted of murder and aggravated kidnapping in the death of Linda Sutton. The prosecution was looking for the death sentence. During the sentencing phase, Edward's attorney, Carol Anfinson, argued that Edward was immature, impulsive, and simplistic, and he was just following the orders of the crew's leader, Robin Gext. The lawyer described him as a lonely person who would do almost anything to please his friend. Edward Spritzer was sentenced to death. He exhausted all of his appeals, despite claims by his attorney Gary Pritchard that he was denied due process and that an examination after the trial indicated that he had brain damage. His lawyer argued that the jury wasn't correctly instructed. In 2003, Edwards' sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole after Governor George H. Ryan commuted the sentences of everyone on death row in Illinois. Andrew Cocorales, one of the brothers, was Governor Ryan's only execution just over 2 months into his administration. Andrew was also the last inmate to be executed in Illinois almost 12 years before Governor Pat Quinn signed legislation to abolish the death penalty on March 9, 2011, and commuted 15 death sentences to life imprisonment without parole. Thomas, one of the brothers, he tried to block his confession from being admitted into his trial, but he lost. He was convicted in 1984 and he was sentenced to 70 years in prison for his part in Lorraine Borowski's murder. Andrew was tried in 2 separate counties. The first trial was for the murder of Rose Beck Davis. In his confession, he admitted that he abducted Rose with the other men, forced her into the van, and beat her with a hatchet until she was dead. The jury deliberated just over 3 hours before finding him guilty of rape and murder. At his trial, Andrew recanted everything that he confessed 4 different times, and he denied that he killed or raped anyone. He claimed that the police coerced each of his confessions, made false promises, and even beat him into admitting what they wanted him to say. Prosecutor Brian Tillander went through the interrogations performed by 6 separate detectives and 2 prosecutors, but Andrew insisted that they told him exactly what to say. He also indicated that one police officer told him the details of the crime scene, giving him all that he needed to confess. Yet, when Detective Warren Wilcox took the stand to describe his interrogation, he said that when he showed Andrew a line of photos, he picked out Lorraine Borowski and said, quote, "That's the girl Eddie Spritzer and I killed in the cemetery," end of quote. The jury deliberated only 3 hours before returning their verdict. They found Andrew guilty of the murder of Lorraine Borowski and sentenced him to death. At his sentencing hearing, he once again denied the charges, and his attorneys argued later that despite the verdict, the act didn't merit the death penalty. In addition, a prison chaplain and a counselor testified that Andrew was non-threatening and could be rehabilitated. Andrew argued that he received ineffective counsel at sentencing and that in the case of the murder of Rose Beck Davis from the earlier trial, that offense didn't warrant the death penalty, but rather life in prison. He insisted that the court didn't prove his intent to kill or any degree of premeditation. The panel of judges dismissed the appeals and upheld the sentence in 1989. So then, his attorneys, they tried something else. They argued that Andrew was a killer suffering from schizophrenia, so he didn't know what he was doing when he committed the murder. They claimed that the trial lawyers should have entered an insanity defense, but they didn't. They didn't have him evaluated, which was a significant oversight on their part. The appeals attorneys also argued that when those lawyers failed to see the need for an evaluation, the trial judge should have ordered one for the court, but he didn't. In fact, a prison psychiatrist had diagnosed Andrew with borderline personality disorder and found him incompetent to stand trial. However, psychiatric diagnosis would not make him incompetent or insane, so this was kind of a weak argument. They argued that Andrew was vulnerable to a strong influence and therefore he was not entirely responsible for what he did. When the district judge questioned the trial attorneys about these issues, they claimed that no pattern of aberrant behavior made anyone who knew the defendant suspect a psychiatric disorder. This satisfied the judge that the pending affidavit was unpersuasive. But the appeals attorneys pointed to Andrew's bizarre behavior as proof of his aberrant condition. The court considered this and decided that the abnormal behavior doesn't imply the type of mental impairment required for a finding of insanity. In a 41-page opinion, the court said that it found no reversible error and affirmed the sentence again. Andrew Kokorales was scheduled to be executed on March 17, 1999. Efforts were made on Andrew's behalf, with then Illinois Governor George Ryan and Supreme Court Justice Moses Harrison was persuaded to order a stay of execution, as well as calling for a moratorium on all executions in Illinois. 12 people had recently been exonerated and removed from Illinois' death row, which shook Governor Ryan. Some of them were exonerated by DNA evidence, and others exonerated by revelations of poor handling by the legal system. And just hours before Andrew was scheduled for execution, Governor Ryan issued a 3-page statement to the effect that the jury had decided his fate according to the law of the land. His attempts to appeal had been rejected over 16 years, so the governor was not about to stand in the way. So there were no further barriers between Andrew and his death. On the morning before his execution, Andrew, he was still convinced that it was not going to happen. He was flown to a super maximum security prison in Thames, Illinois, and he spent the rest of the day praying and fasting. He then spoke to a few friends on the phone, bidding them farewell. Andrew still believed that there would be a last-minute pardon. Strapped onto the gurney, he offered the Borowski family an apology, said that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, and then he received the lethal injection at 12:34 p.m. So, just as a quick timeline of his convictions, in 1985, Andrew Kokorale was convicted of murder, aggravated kidnapping, and rape in the death of Rose Davis. The prosecution sought a death sentence. During the sentencing phase, Andrew's attorney said that his client had been a follower, not an organizer, not the prime mover in Rose's murder. The jury spared Andrew's life after deliberating for 90 minutes, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On 18th of March 1987, Andrew was convicted of murder and aggravated kidnapping in the death of Lorraine Borowski. He was then sentenced to death on April 30th, 1987. The Kokorale brothers were raised Greek Orthodox, and the Orthodox Church tried and failed to keep Andrew from being executed. Demetrios Kantzavelos, at that time a chancellor and later a bishop of the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Chicago, became an anti-death penalty activist as a result of the execution and helped lobby in favor of ending the death penalty in the state. Thomas, the other brother, was convicted of murder and rape in the death of Lorraine Borowski. As a reward for his detailed confession, he was sentenced to life without parole. On appeal, the rape conviction was reversed and Thomas won a new trial on his murder conviction. Rather than face a retrial, he pleaded guilty to Lorraine's murder in exchange for a 70-year sentence. As part of a plea agreement, charges in the murder of Linda Sutton were dismissed. Thomas, he was scheduled to be paroled on September 30th, 2017, but he was denied release after he couldn't find an approved place to live. He was released from prison on 29th of March 2019. As of June 30th, 2019, Thomas lives at Wayside Cross Ministries at 215 New York Street in Aurora, Illinois. In an interview with WBBM TV, Thomas proclaimed his innocence, saying that everybody thinks I'm a monster. I'm not a monster. At the time of his arrest, Thomas was a painter with no criminal record. He was described as having a borderline range of intellect with an IQ of 75. Robin Guest was the only one who didn't confess to any murder, and so he was also the only one never convicted of murder. He was only convicted of the non-fatal attack on Beverly Washington, so he's eligible for parole in 2042. He will be 88 years old by then, so like I said at the beginning of this video, it's kind of like a life in prison situation here, because he will be 88 and fingers crossed he's not gonna reach the age of 88, because I think that would be too much of a privilege for him. So now remember that Robin, he's a father of 3, right? I mean, I mentioned this a bit at the beginning of the video. Well, in March 1999, his son, 18-year-old David, was charged with first-degree murder for the gang-related killing of 35 years old Roberto Cruz on January 29, 1999, in northwest Chicago. 2 other men, 19-year-old Richard Quill and 27-year-old Ruben Hernandez, were also charged. David, who was the triggerman, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 45 years in prison. He has a projected parole date of March 2nd, 2044. So I don't know how is that saying. I forgot the saying, but are you made a murderer or are you born a murderer? I forgot the saying. Oh my god, I'm having a blank now. Aha, nature or nurture. That's it. In the case of David. So the other person involved in this murder, Richard Quill, who was the lookout, was convicted of first-degree murder and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. He has a projected parole date of March 1st, 2029. Ruben Hernandez, who planned and coordinated the shooting, was convicted of first-degree murder and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He has a projected parole date of December 12, 2059. All 3 men are serving their sentences at Pontiac Correctional Center. On 25th of May 2022, David Gecht was granted a new trial, and I don't know any more than that. I don't know the results of that. All in all, the Reaper crew, or the Chicago Reapers, was a satanic cult composed of Robin, Edward, Andrew, and Thomas. They were suspected in the disappearances of 18 women in Chicago, Illinois. Robin allegedly had an altar in the attic of his northwest side home where the group gathered during the evening hours after Robin's wife was gone to work. He had 6 red and black crosses painted on the walls and covered the altar with a red cloth. They would all kneel together around the altar and Robin would produce the freshly removed breasts. Robin and his crew allegedly drove around in a van looking for prostitutes to sacrifice in Robin's apartment. They claimed to have removed 1 breast from each victim and eaten it as Robin read passages of the Satanic Bible. It has also been said that after severing the breasts, they took turns raping the open wound. They then each masturbated into the flesh of the breast, chopped it into pieces, and devoured it. Yeah. I don't want to get that picture in my head. At age 30, Robin was the only adult and assumed the role of mentor and leader. Edward Spritzer was 21 years old, and the brothers Tommy and Andrew, they were only teenagers. Michael Newton, who wrote an encyclopedia of modern serial killers, interviewed Robin Gecht. He wanted to know why Robin was so obsessed with women's breasts. Asking him, Robin said, quote, "Well, in answer to your question on obsession with breasts, it's a thing with my entire family. Going back, as I'm told, to great-grandfather. Each of us men have married large-breast women. My ex-wife is a 39D, and yes, she was very satisfying to me. As to your question about having sex with breasts, I have no real obsession with breasts in that form. Only a very sick person would even think that," end quote. Maybe someone like you, Robin, allegedly. According to the author, Edward Spritzer claimed that Robin once became so furious with his wife that he cut off her nipples. Robin claims, of course, that he's innocent of innocent of any murder actually, and that he didn't even know the other members when most of the victims were killed. He said, "First mistake is considering me a serial killer. I'm not considered one. I have never killed or took part in any such acts, nor ever charged in any murders of anyone." Edward Spritzer is adamant about Robin's guilt and offers detailed descriptions of his attacks. Among other things, he said that a black female was picked up, blindfolded and gagged. Robin shot her point blank in the head. He put chains around her neck and legs, attached 2 bowling balls and threw her in the water. Edward doesn't think that her body was ever found. In the spring of 1981, the Reapers found their first known victim, Linda, behind the Brer Rabbit Hotel in Chicago, which was a well-known hangout for prostitutes. According to him, Linda was gang raped, sodomized, and her left breast was cut off while she was still alive. Around 1 year later, a red van pulled up alongside Lorraine as she was walking to work. When she refused the driver's offer for a ride, two men jumped out of the van and grabbed her, then took her to a motel room where they gang raped and beat her. A wire was wound around one of her breasts until it was severed from her body and fell to the floor. According to Edward's sworn testimony, Robin had sex with her breast and then finished her off with an axe. Only days later, they abducted a young Chinese woman, Shui Mak, drove her to an isolated wooded area where they raped her, cut off her breasts, sliced her body to ribbons, and buried her in a hole. Apparently, Rose Beck, a businesswoman known for her independent mind and outspokenness, was a victim who was not willing to go without a fight. When her body was found, a pool of dried blood lay beneath her anal cavity and her face was crushed beyond recognition. By the point of the crew's arrest, many women had come forward with chilling stories of the torture they said Robin had inflicted on them. Most of these tortures included some kind of breast mutilation with needles and knives. Several women said that Robin asked them to cut off their own nipples because Robin wanted to see how they worked. Not surprisingly, Robin denies this. Robin is still desperately trying to obtain the DNA testing that he is certain will clear him of all charges. So far, he has been unsuccessful. No one will budge on the issue of DNA testing. He says, quote, "I don't only face the injustices, but the nightmares that follows. You have no idea the pain and hurt I face and feel every single day I sit here and lose hope. I'm not an angel, but I never intentionally hurt anyone unless it was to protect myself or my family. I could never live with killing or knowing I was responsible for taking one's life." End of quote. Despite powerful eyewitness testimony, there is simply no hard evidence to prove that Robin is guilty of anything but attempted murder of the last victim. Robin's family, especially his wife, are 100% behind him and believe in his innocence. And if I would be his wife, I think I would be the first one to get really suspicious because he had some issues with her as well, didn't he? And asked her to do something with her breast. So at least, find that a bit weird because it's not normal. Just like it's not normal to cut off a breast. Oh, can you just imagine? I don't need these pictures in my head. I don't need them in my brain. But like, okay, cut off the breast. The breast falls on the floor. You masturbate on the breast. And then eat the breast after you masturbated on the breast. Oh, Jesus Christus. Dios mío. Oh, anyway, I won't keep you guys any longer. I hope I didn't get any kind of image in your heads either. And anyway, I hope you didn't eat anything because I forgot to warn you at the beginning of this video not to eat, but this was completely disgusting. And it's incredible that Robin was never charged with any of the murders, and it's clear from everything that I've told you that he was the leader, that he orchestrated all of these murders, and he was the one who actually did the murders. So I don't know where it went wrong in the investigation, but please guys, let me know what do you think about this case in the comments down below. For now, stay safe, take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!